Our community comes together once again to reflect on the message of our greatest civil rights leader and Boston University's most distinguished alumnus. Last year, Ken Elmore, who is here today, the Dean of Students. Ken, where are you? Stand, please. Ken reflected on the direction our country was taking after the installation of a new government in Washington, D.C. And the year before, Winston Langley, who's the provost of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, drew a parallel between Martin Luther King and Qasim Nazrul Islam, the Muslim poet laureate of Bangladesh, at a time when terrorism was at the forefront of the national conversation. And the year before, Kermit Crawford spoke on issues of race and violence shortly after the Ferguson shooting. Others, including John Paul, Marcel Willock, who is also here today, and Robin Davidoff, who is also here, have found the courage required to speak from this podium to celebrate MLK's legacy. And today, after a tumultuous year in so many ways, Jonathan Woodson will address the audience. He's yet to tell me his topic. But Jonathan needs no introduction on this medical campus, but for those of you who are unfamiliar with this remarkable individual, I'd like to summarize some of his accomplishments. Dr. Woodson received his BS in biomedical science, magna cum laude from the City College of New York, and his MD degree from New York University School of Medicine. His postgraduate medical education took place at Massachusetts General Hospital, where he completed residency training in internal medicine, general and vascular surgery. And he is only board certified in internal medicine, general surgery, vascular surgery, and critical care. Dr. Woodson swiftly ascended through the ranks in the United States Army, and he holds the rank of Brigadier General in the Army Reserves. He obtained a master's degree in strategic studies from the U.S. Army War College, and he is a veteran of Operation Desert Storm, Operation Enduring Freedom, and Operation Iraqi Freedom. Dr. Woodson served from 2010 to 2016 as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs in the United States Department of Defense during the Obama administration. Currently, Dr. Woodson leads the Boston University's Institute for Health System Innovation and Policy. He is the Lars Anderson Professor in Management and Professor of the Practice of Management at the Questrom School of Business. He also holds joint appointments as Professor of Surgery here in the School of Medicine and Professor of Health Law, Policy and Management at the School of Public Health. On a personal note, I cherish the many experiences I had with Jonathan when we worked together in the operating room. And I will always thank you, Jonathan, for the support you lent our sons when they were training to become Navy officers. And I am so humbled to having followed in your footsteps as Associate Dean for Diversity in our School of Medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jonathan with the Before we give the podium to Dr. Woodson, let us begin this event by an invocation by Reverend Julian Armand Cook. Reverend Cook is the senior pastor of St. Mark Congregational Church and an assistant director at Boston University's Howard Thurman Center. Reverend Cook, please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Let us pray. God, our eternal maker and sustainer, the author of our highest hopes and the architect of our grandest dreams, we thank you. For you are the God who empowered the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. not just to have a dream, but to have a determination for all humanity to reach a destination called dignity and a future called freedom. Nevertheless, in our gratitude, we do not take this moment lightly, O God, for we recognize that 51 years ago this week, a man was beginning the last year of his life. Yet we are not discouraged. We are not despairing, because we know that no amount of death is big enough to kill a dream. Especially in this day, when our nation is torn asunder with words and acts of hatred and policies of inequality, we are challenged and inspired and renewed by the vision and witness of Dr. King. So even as we watch in concern, We will work in hope, because justice may be deferred, it may be delayed, but it cannot be destroyed. Help us, your children, to love one another. Teach us the true meaning of the words of your servant, Dr. King, when he said, "Love does not give us a high blood pressure of creeds and an anemia of deeds, but love is the only power that preserves community, and we shall overcome." Amen.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor for me to be here today and see so many colleagues and old friends, people we were in the trenches with together to share in the commemoration of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King and all that he represented. And so, Raphael, you're right, I didn't give you a title for my talk, and part of the reason is that when I am asked to do some of these things, it takes a period of reflection before you decide what you want to capture and what you want to focus on. So if I had to give you a title for my talk, it would be "My Soul Looks Back, Lest I Forget." And there's a lot in that, and so let's jump right in here. You know, it really is an honor and privilege to be here, to be the speaker on this 89th anniversary of what would be the birth of Martin Luther King, and of course we're approaching the 50th anniversary of his tragic death in April of 1968, particularly in a year, as has already been said, where the era of hope and change has given way to a reversal, if you will, of many of those progressive policies that benefited so many of the vulnerable in our society. And so we need to think about that, and we need to think about what our responsibilities are to continue the dream and to continue the progress. The significance of MLK's short life of 39 years and his career of activism, which just spanned 12 years, that's remarkable considering all he's remembered for and all that he got accomplished, really yields new meaning and significance for American society with each passing year, and certainly it does for me. It defines the enormous potential for impact that each of us can have if we commit to living our values and hold others to account for and live up to their values. By nature, you know, I'm a private person, but you know, there comes a time in life when testimony, public testimony, if you will, and the telling of personal stories is important in defining the impact that others have had on your life and your ability to make contributions and create opportunity. We do need to acknowledge publicly the shoulders upon which individuals we rise and stand. And so I come to the reflections today that I'm going to share with you about MLK and other heroes from that time from a deeply personal point of view and as an eyewitness to some of that history. To reveal a little bit, you know, I was born in the 50s into a family of limited financial means, but strong values, which were not uncommon at that time. When segregation still flourished, Brown versus the Board of Ed had just been adjudicated in the courts, but the affirmation in real terms that separate could never be equal was far from implemented and certainly not realized. I would eventually be a product of that controversial busing strategy and consequently the object of occasional angry groups who did not want blacks or Negroes, as we were known in those days, in their communities or schools. Notice of potential trouble on any given day would quietly be passed through the black population at my school in Sheepshead Bay, and plans would be made to leave early or find alternate routine routes home to avoid trouble through Canarsie and other communities. There would be on certain days the need to run the gauntlet, as it were, as we made our way back from school. I came of age in tumultuous 60s with strong Baptist roots and watched as my Baptist minister father, and of course that is a deep connection, and other clergy in the family joined protest marches and debated the issues of the day in the church and witnessed the worry and concern on my mother's face. Because you see, the issues were important, but the outcome and the magnitude of the personal sacrifice at that time was very unclear. I remember the intense discussions about the Selma marches and the evolving civil rights events at what was then very frequent, very vocal family gatherings. As a family, we palpably felt the horror of what became the scenes at the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, and felt the collective joy expressed by the signing of the 1964 Civil Rights and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. We, like many families, had the coveted picture of Dr. Martin Luther King proudly displayed. Now, on the other hand, you need to know that my brother and sister, somewhat older than I, voiced opinions that were actually more aggressive, impatient, and definitive than my mother and father's generation, and really were consistent with the emerging tension that were those that aligned themselves with MLK and those that were supporting the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Nation of Islam, and the emerging Black Power movement. As you can see, we were moving from being colored to Negroes to being Black and African Americans. It was a change, and it was palpable throughout the generations then. The mood was shifting in Black communities, and less well appreciated now is the strength and resolve that MLK showed to the nonviolent approach to promoting civil rights reforms, when it would have been easier for him to abandon this position to get larger and more collective support. My brother and sister needed to be part of the protest demonstrations of the day, and I can recall almost daily my sister coming home from City College of New York and having been part of some protest march. There was always something to talk about back in that day. My personal appearance with my large afro, hard to imagine now, I know, and my army jacket with the red, black, and green patch on the shoulder gave my mother great concern. And she was concerned really because she thought I would be targeted by police, which did occur, particularly when I drove my father's car. I can't tell you the number of times I was stopped. My grandmother, who died when she was 100 years old, lived with us as part of an extended family and added another dimension to the picture. Born at the turn of the 20th century, with Native American and slavery ancestry, she had witnessed the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and sent sons to go off and fight in a segregated army. Service, which my father and uncles, despite the conditions, were intensely proud. I learned about this later in life when I was commissioned as a captain, and it brought a tear to their eyes, the fact that I could be commissioned as a captain when that would have never been possible in their day and age. Now, my father was not alive when I was promoted to the rank of general, but my uncle was, and I remember him calling me periodically and say, "Uncle, what's going on?" He said, "Nothing much. It's just nice to know that I can talk to a general." My grandmother had seen and experienced a lot of negative racial encounters, but she also had seen change, knew much more needed to be done, but had a calming spirit, which became the counterbalance to the impassioned, inflamed state my sister would return from school and the rally of the day. I can remember her saying in her high-pitched voice, "Honey, it's going to be all right." Now, this attitude did not reflect complacency, but a deep faith, the deeper faith and understanding that comes with living a long life and understanding the ebb and flow of events. We would overcome. Yet even though we all in my family, like many other families, wanted the same thing, the path and the level of impatience was significantly different across the generations. And as the decade evolved, the friction caused by the Vietnam War and ongoing racial tension, differing philosophies about how to lead, promote, and drive transformation of the American society, and the general seismic cultural changes occurring in our society that led to the violence and the death of MLK and RFK in '68, were all part of that intense swirl. I had a front row seat to the riots, which engulfed my community in New York City and many major cities around the country that summer. I remember vividly heeding the warning of my mother that summer to be home by 5 p.m., which was distinctly unusual for the summer months when we could stay out much longer. When I came home, I would find battalions of mounted and dismounted police in riot gear literally staging outside of our door to march a few blocks away, which at the time was the epicenter of the unrest in Brooklyn. To this day, I remember the fear and the tears one night when my brother failed to return home, having missed his curfew. It turned out that he got caught up in some events, but found his way and stayed at a friend's house, but the uncertainty of the times took its toll on mothers. I remember that particularly for my mother. Therefore, these and for many other reasons I do not have time to talk about today, this holiday is deeply meaningful for me and evokes a myriad of feelings and takes on new significance each year, particularly as new opportunities for me to contribute reveal themselves. You see, I know whose shoulders I stand on. You know, Dorothy Winbush Riley in 1991 published an anthology of quotes of people of color, many connected to the civil rights movement, entitled "My Soul Looks Back, Lest I Forget." Now, it's not a book that is meant to be read cover to cover in order, although it is chronologically arranged for events, but it's meant to be used as a reference to give the reader some insight into how important and relevant persons and luminaries of the time express views about concepts like freedom, democracy, racism, and many others. One reviewer called it a tapestry of strong evocations and well-documented sentiments. Now, it's not clear to me how she arrived at the title, but I suspect the first part, "My Soul Looks Back," relates to an old spiritual song that was sung so well by a gospel singer by the name of Mahalia Jackson, who was a friend and confidant to Martin Luther King. This song, like several other spirituals, became an anthem for the struggle. Its lyrics describe the struggles of life and the faith that endures and supports one through difficult time. It says in part, and I quote, "I have been falling and rising all of these years, but you know, my soul looks back and wonders how I made it over." Now, my grandmother understood this intuitively and profoundly. Maybe not so much my sister at that time, but today she understands it intuitively and profoundly. On a day like today, it is important to look back with one's soul. Do some introspection, not forget the lessons of the past, and find strength and optimism for the future. This may be particularly important and needed after experiencing the events of the past couple of years in our nation's politics and race relations, which might lead many to suggest we have regressed as a nation. But more about this later. You know, Merriam-Webster often offers several definitions for the word soul, but the most compelling in the context I'd like to use today is the moral and emotional nature of a human being, a person's total self. When examining the contributions of King and other civil rights leaders and the challenges they face in the context of the times, one cannot see the full meanings of their lives, their commitments, their challenges, their risks, and the impacts of their being on this earth by being logical, academic, or impassionate. We must examine this history with our souls, our moral and emotional being, lest we forget how truly difficult the times were in so many dimensions. We need to look back and wonder how we got over, how we gained strength, and in so doing, see the pathway to continuing to make progress in this democracy and living up to its values, even as we temporarily have setbacks and the challenges seem to abound. Therefore, this holiday, perhaps like none other, is deeply personal and emotional for me. Having recently served in government and participated in a progressive administration focused on important issues like economic equality, healthcare, educational opportunity for all, I am acutely aware that the social struggles of decades ago are with us today and require persistent attention and activism. During my time at the Pentagon, I came to know a person by the name of Jay Johnson. He was the Pentagon General Counsel and later became Homeland Security Secretary. And parenthetically, he was the nephew to the late Ken Edlin, the former Associate Dean for Minority Affairs here at the School of Medicine, and the person I followed. Jay was unique. He was a 1979 graduate of Morehouse College and a friend of MLK III, the son of Martin Luther King Jr. And for this and other reasons, he had been to the King home any number of times. He came to know and feel and embrace the deep values of MLK, and more importantly, live these values. I witnessed and learned from him and Jay about how principled people can and should use their positions to change entrenched organizations and have enormous impact by doing what is right, living one's values. During my tenure at the Pentagon, I witnessed and participated with him in the fall of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, the ability of gay men and women to openly serve in the armed forces, the opening of all military occupational specialties to women, and the elimination of the prohibition on transgender persons, which we personally helped develop as a policy. In a speech Jay gave at the Pentagon in 2011, he reminded us that the last speech that King gave on the night before his death, the speech that has become to be known as the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, a speech largely really about economic empowerment. King, with great effect, drew a parallel between the priest and the Levite who passed a man on the road to Jericho who had been beaten and robbed and in need of aid, and they failed to help this individual. King used the parable to criticize those who are compassionate by proxy, complacent or motivated to action when it's only convenient. He said to the audience in Memphis that night, as Jay said to us at the Pentagon, and I now say to you, the question is not if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? The question is if I do not stop to help, what will happen to him? A profound lesson in selfless service. It's not about me, it's about you. What happens to the abused, the disenfranchised, the discriminated, those unempowered if we fail to stop and take action? The social struggles I witnessed as a child, adolescent, and young adult left indelible marks on my character and outlook on life. And so I'd like to share with you just for a moment an analysis of some contemporary challenges we face in today's society through the lens and the principles of MLK and how he and the leaders of that age practiced some 50 to 60 years ago. First, it's important to note that it was a struggle champion led by young people. MLK was only 26 when he organized and led the bus boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama. This is not to say that older folks were inconsequential to the effort and did not contribute, but it suggests that young people are very important to creating the energy, momentum, impatience, and voice for change. They do challenge older folks on the need to change and the pace of that change. Therefore, the first takeaway is the need to understand, as educators, mentors in this room, the importance of nurturing young people as critical thinkers with values and a sense of responsibility to improve and change our society, particularly for those who are not empowered to stand for themselves. You know, when I speak on leadership, particularly strategic leadership, I emphasize values-based leadership and decision-making. Values cannot be overemphasized, as they are the compass that allows one to make good decisions when conditions are difficult and challenges are large. I have a number of values. I often talk about those, including loyalty to mission, duty, a commitment to do your job well and when needed, respect for the contribution of others and other teammates, selfless service, honor, integrity, and the most difficult is personal courage. When I want to examine how well I've done and how well I've lived up to these values or principles, I frequently examine them against the actions of those of the civil rights era, MLK, and the other leaders, some 50 or 60 years ago. People well known, such as MLK, Rosa Parks, but less well known individuals such as Charles Houston, who set the stage for the overturn of separate but equal, and Virginia and Clifford Dorr, who were actually white citizens who supported, in fact, integration, but suffered greatly in terms of their business and their prosperity. Or Joanne Robinson, an untold hero in the elimination of segregated busing in the South. These individuals took action based upon their values and their acceptance of their responsibility to live up to those values, to persevere despite not being assured the future and the potential for great personal loss. Now, MLK was not perfect, and his thinking and philosophy evolved over the years as a civil rights leader. His career spanned 12 relatively short years, as noted, but during that time, he grew in understanding that although he had important responsibilities to address the inequities of blacks in this country brought about by a history of slavery and Jim Crow laws, he eventually realized that any group so diminished was the focus of his struggle. In fact, a speech on the steps of the Alabama State Capitol on March 25, 1965, after 3 civil rights marchers had been killed, including one white priest, and also John Lewis had been beaten at the Edmund Pettus Bridge. King praised white clergy who had marched with blacks and suffered many abuses in showing support in the civil rights movement. He noted segregation was on its deathbed, but at that time it was now time to march on poverty, which affected a much larger segment of society. Later that year, in one of the less celebrated speeches called The American Dream, not to be confused with his I Have a Dream speech, which was delivered 2 years earlier, he addressed the topic still important today: living wages for workers in menial jobs, income equality, and the challenges of preserving a multicultural democracy. He spoke of the dignity of all workers so that they can live, educate their children, buy a home, and have basic necessities of life. He said, "I have seen my dream shattered," again referring to that earlier I Have a Dream speech. "As I've been through Appalachia and I've seen my white brothers along with Negroes living in poverty, and I'm concerned about white poverty as much as I'm concerned about Negro poverty." King asked, "How are you going to have a multiracial democracy," read that as post-racial democracy, "if inequality makes life so harsh and competitive at the bottom, where society is most multiracial and multinational?" King noted class divisions can be as vicious and evil as a system based upon racial injustice. Now consider the profoundness of this statement and these words in the context of the most recent presidential election. If more politicians had been clearer and more consistent in their messaging that it's about economic opportunity for all, would we have seen a different outcome from the election? The competitiveness at the bottom, when leaders do not define a pathway for opportunity for all, creates the environment for the alt-right to rise. The optimism expressed and felt at the time of Barack Obama's election, that promise of a post-racial America, that it could be achieved, was lost, hopefully temporarily, because the message was muddled into us versus them. At the time of his death, MLK had traveled to Memphis, not for another anti-segregation rally, but to fight for economic justice for sanitation workers. He understood that the lack of opportunity to earn a living wage enslaved a much larger population of this country and had second and third order consequences for all of us. Had we understood and articulated this message in the presidential campaign of 2016, I'm sure the outcome would have been different. As previously stated, many contributed substantially to the efforts of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. MLK came not only to be an icon in his own right, but also to symbolize many of these great people. Because of his premature death at age 39, not only did he become a martyr, but the gold standard against which to evaluate the fight for social justice and the effective methods to make progress. It is fair then to ask, when looking at the issues of in the US today, what would MLK do? Now, some think this question a cliche, and in fact, it was debated a few years ago about looking retrospectively this way because no one can actually be sure what MLK would do. But I submit that the conditions and challenges of the time in which he led provides a litmus test for clarity of purpose and values through which issues, challenges, and efforts of today can be examined. MLK scholars have written much about his writings and speeches. MLK wrote 5 books, and at the peak of his activity was delivering 450 speeches a year. So there's abundant material to analyze. The issue, though, for me, all is summed up in one of his writings, and it's called The Letter from the Birmingham Jail, written in April 1963 after one of his many arrests. It was not written in anger and almost not written. It was a response to an article he read in a smuggled-in newspaper entitled A Call for Unity, written by 8 white Alabama clergymen criticizing King and his movement and the fellow marchers and supporters on the methods that they were using and how they were breaking laws and offering the argument that the courts were the proper way to seek remedy from racial injustice. In a masterful piece of writing and clarity of thought, King frames the justification for the nonviolent campaign, but more importantly frames for all of us, for all time, how we need to evaluate the correctness and the urgency of our actions and methods to address injustice in society. In many ways, this writing is more relevant today than it was at the time it was written. As we look at institutionalized misogyny, sexual harassment, ongoing racism, economic insecurity, and the events that have created Black Lives Matter movement, King's letter provides a blueprint for action that is scalable, appropriate, and calls us to analyze the correctness of our own action or inaction as individuals. First, King reminds us of our mutual responsibility to each other. He writes of injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, which affects what affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. Second, King acknowledged the importance of creating constructive tension. As we look at so many things in our society today and we're all creating a momentum for change, constructive tension is important. Black Lives Matter is that constructive tension that should drive a rethinking of the use of deadly force by police and bring a new focus on the responsibility of police to reduce tension rather than just justify the use of that force. Parenthetically, this effort would save white lives. The recently released statistics on police shooting deaths show that nearly 1,000 individuals are killed each year, and more than half of them are actually white. The inescapable network of mutuality that brings us together and to which we all belong. Making people feel uncomfortable with the status quo, particularly when we know that existing conditions do not comport well with our global democratic values, requires each of us to raise awareness and make each other uncomfortable. Many knew about the sexual abuses in Hollywood and many other industries, and many should have spoken sooner. King reminds us, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed and by extension supported by those who live up to their values. King makes the point that not only is disobedience justified in the face of unjust laws, but it is necessary and patriotic if remedy cannot be legal by expedient means. Therefore, it is not giving license to just unbreaking laws, but to break unjust laws. And he notes that the courts, despite having passed Brown versus the Board of Education, schools remain segregated. And it turns out, of course, in the courts, if you don't give voting rights to individual and being a registered voter is the only way you can be on a jury, how can you get juries of peers to adjudicate problems? More egregiously, in the segregated and racist South at the time, the courts became an instrument of perpetuating injustice rather than achieving justice. It goes into a great deal into what's defining a just law and what's an unjust law. Unjust laws are immoral, and he writes and gives that the segregator, it gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, and the folks who suffer segregation a false sense of inferiority. Not only is it wrong to use immoral means to achieve moral ends, but it's also the use of moral means to preserve immoral ends is wrong. King also took moderates to task as well, both white and black. Moderates who wanted to go slow and not rock the boat too aggressively. King noted that complacency of moderates results from having a comfortable position at the table, but this is at odds with what's doing morally correct, truly living up to one's values. So as I sum up, in essence, King challenges all of us and gives us no quarter when it comes to having personal courage to do what's right. That is why I have always examined my actions against those who led the civil rights struggle. In his letter, King talked about the sublime courage of the nonviolent protesters and their willingness to suffer. How much are we willing to suffer? We all need to ask what we are willing to suffer and sacrifice. When facing difficult situations today in our society, our policies, and what's changing, and what we should stand for, we need to ask ourselves, how much are we willing to suffer? When we examine what we should expect of our political leaders and ourselves, it is entirely appropriate on this day and other days to have our souls look back and ask the question, what would MLK do? Thank you very much.